Um, there's also a fascinating tradition in England, at least in the 70s, where every Sunday afternoon they used to show old black and white films, really robust ones like Charge of the Light Brigade, Battle of the Bulge, Zulu. And one permanent favorite there used to be a film called Dam Busters, which was about an audacious raid which was carried out against 3 dams in Germany in 1943. Now, James Holland has written the second more publicized book. Reading through his bibliography, I found there are many other books as well. But really the most popular one on the Dam Busters thing. And when I told this to a lot of people that I'd be chairing a session on the Dam Busters, the invariable question, which reading James's book I found, 9 out of 10 people have also asked him, is, and what did you call the dog? Now that's I mean, for those who have seen the film, there's a sort of N-word involved in the name of the dog. But that shouldn't distract from the fact that this was one of the most audacious raids carried out during World War II. And a military historian that he is, he's not merely a historian of the Bomber Command, he's written histories of the North African campaign, the Italian campaign, Battle of Britain, and now he's also written, apart from various works of fiction which are also centered on the war, now he's written this book on the Dam Busters. Now, I think James really has a small slideshow which encapsulate briefly for those who may be unfamiliar with the story what this is all, what the raid was all about. So, without further ado, James. Have you got a handheld one?
Well, thank you very much. And for the 50% of you in the audience that aren't my cricketing teammates, I should explain that I don't normally look like this. But I got hit in the face yesterday when we were playing the Royals, and it serves me right entirely for not being more respectful to Srisan for wearing a helmet. But there you go. This talk I normally do, I thought I was going to be talking for about 50 minutes. In fact, I'm only going to be talking for 30. So my slides are designed for the longer talk, but I'm just going to sort of whittle through them at breakneck speed. And I'm just also going to make sure that this works. Oh, I got too quick. There you go. Sorry, there you are. Can you hear me now? Much better? I'll keep it closed. The Dam Busters raid took place on the night of the 16th, 17th of May, but I'm just going to begin very quickly, if I may, by talking about an operation to bomb Berlin by RAF Bomber Command on the night of the 17th of January 1943. And this was significant because it was the first time a journalist had gone on aboard a Lancaster bomber like the one you're looking at on the screen. And that journalist was Richard Dimbleby. Over in the UK, his 2 sons are very well-known journalists themselves. He was indeed one of the leading journalists of his time. And he went aboard, and they flew to Berlin. This was the first time Bomber Command had hit Berlin in about a year. And he found this an absolutely alarming experience, as you can imagine. He was up near the front, sitting next to the pilot on the dicky seat, which is normally reserved for the flight engineer. And he went up there, and of course he took off, and that was hair-raising enough. Then he got over the Dutch coast and started being hit by, there's flak from the German artillery batteries, anti-aircraft batteries on the Dutch coast started firing up these shells, little sparks of light, and the aircraft started rattling. Then it all died down again. They got through that bit, and then finally they were over Berlin itself, and suddenly he could see there was more and more flak rising up through the air. And the plane was being jolted and thumped all over the place, and then suddenly a big shell went off nearby, and he said it was like It was like a fist going underneath the aircraft and smashing it and hoisting it 30 foot straight into the air. And anyway, they got over the target eventually, and you could see all these little lights going off. And when they got to the target, the bomber said, well, I'm sorry, Skipper, I can't see anything. I can't see this. And so the captain said, well, that's all right. We'll go round again. Now, this is no small thing. I mean, you know, for anyone who's been on doing circuits around Delhi or Jaipur or something, I mean, it takes a long time. You've got to go right across the city, circle all the way around, and come back and do your bomb run all over again. And this is what happened. And they get over it a second time. And the target is still clouded in, it's put in cloud. And the bomber says, well, I'm sorry, Skipper, I can't see the target. So the skipper goes, all right, well, we'll go around again. All very cheery, all very calm. And eventually, the third time, they managed to drop their bombs, which is just a single 8,000-pound bomb, and off they go, and they managed to land back. And the following day, Richard Dimbleby does his broadcast, an account of this raid. And Bomber Command, no one really knows much within the British public about what they actually do and what they achieve and what it's like. So this is one of the first pictures of what it's actually like to go on one of these Lancasters and go on one of these raids. And he's absolutely astonished. And he says one of the things that's absolutely amazing is the calmness, the bravery, the cool courage of these men. Now, the interesting thing is that the skipper of that Lancaster was a young squadron leader, still only just 24 years old, called Guy Gibson. Guy Gibson had been, he'd been squadron commander of 106 Squadron at Sarston since the previous April. So he was coming, you know, he'd done a good 9 months. And he was also one of the most experienced bomber pilots of that period. He'd flown some 65 combat missions. The most you're ever supposed to do is about 50, so he was already over that. He'd also done a stint as a night fighter. This was a man who'd done more than was required by most people at any point during the war if you were a bomber. And the person who put him there was a guy called Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris. And Bomber Harris, as he was known, only took over Bomber Command at the beginning of, in February 1942, so sometime into the war. But at that time, Bomber Command was really not the huge, great machine that it became by the end of the war. It was actually quite stuck in the mud. Technologically, it wasn't very developed. They had rather old-fashioned aircraft, twin-engine things like this. This is a Hampton or the Wellington, designed in principle by a young assistant chief designer at Vickers Aviation called Barnes Wallis. But even so, these are sort of small fry aircraft, really. And Bomber Command doesn't have tools that it needs in the beginning of 1942 to really do accurate bombing. It's very sort of scattergun in its approach. So lots of planes go over, they get shot down, some of them get shot down. Those that don't drop their bombs willy-nilly. There's no real sense of them hitting a specific target, even though they're trying. So what Bomber Harris does in his first year of command is try and build up strength, try and build up the numbers of 4-engine bombers, which can obviously carry proportionally much more bombs than a 2-engine bomber. He's trying to improve navigation techniques. And by the beginning of 1943, by the sort of end of January, beginning of February 1943, Bomber Command is in a slightly better situation. It's got new navigation aids called OBO. It's got another one called H2S. And these are all just improvements on navigation, on getting to the target accurately. He's also had to give way a lot of his potential airfields for the heavy bombers to the Americans who started coming over in the summer of 1942. So this is why it's taken quite a long time to get going. Now, is there another way of doing bombing other than high-level stuff, which is not very accurate? Well, the answer is they tried it. They tried it in April 1942. It was one of the first operations that the Lancaster, the new Lancaster bomber, which only came at the beginning of 1942, undertakes. 12 aircraft take off to bomb the manned diesel plant, which makes diesel engines for U-boats in Augsburg. And during that raid, it's an absolute disaster. And 7 out of the 12 machines get shot down, and not a single one comes back unscathed. And they do this in daylight. They go out there in daylight, and they do it very, very low level. And it proves to Harris that there is no future at all in low-level bombing. So at the beginning of February 1942, he's poised to start what he calls his all-out offensive. which is where he's massed enough four-engine bombers, he's got his new navigational aids in H2S and OPO and these other new techniques that are coming in. And he knows what he's about. He knows what he's got to do. So you can imagine he was over the moon when he heard from his old mate, Air Vice Marshal Sid Liddell, from the Department of Ministry of Aircraft Production, that there was plans afoot to send 30 of his precious Lancasters to bomb some dams in Germany, flying low level with a bomb that bounced on water. To say that Harris had a sense of humour failure is to put it absolutely mildly, and frankly, I sort of have a certain amount of sympathy for him. And this is a very famous letter that he sends to the Chief of the Air Staff, who is the top guy. Harris is not the top guy, he's just in charge of Bomber Command. This is a letter he sends to Air Chief Marshal Charles Paulson. And he says, basically, I've heard about this plan, it's absolutely insane. These mad scientists who think they can win the war with sort of madcap schemes need to be stopped. I don't want anything to do with it, and I'm sure you agree, don't you, Sir Charles? And he thinks at that point that is going to be the end of the matter, but it isn't. Because Barnes-Wallis, unlike the famous film that Swapan was talking about earlier on, was not hitting a brick wall of bureaucrats who didn't share his vision. He actually was a very, very cunning political manipulator and had enough of the right people on his side. So what does Barnes-Wallis do? Well, he's assistant chief designer at Vickers Aviation. And what that means is because he's not chief designer, he's actually given a little bit of latitude to develop other things. And one of the plans he's developed is, he's constantly been thinking about since the beginning of the war, is this idea that if you can just destroy German infrastructure, you don't need to destroy their cities, you don't need to destroy war factories and tank factories and so on. If you cut off the oil supply, if you cut off the water supply, none of these factories will work. And so that's what you need to do. So he developed this thing called what he called a victory bomber, which had 6 engines and was going to drop a 10-ton bomb from 40,000 feet, which would penetrate 30 meters into the ground, create a kind of seismic earthquake, which would then destroy oil dumps and coal seams and collieries and so on, and indeed dams, and therefore crippled Germany so much that they wouldn't be able to fight. That was his principle, and he didn't get very far with it, to be honest. But then later on, technical glitch, he conceived this idea of a bouncing bomb. And what his original intention was not to go and destroy dams, but actually destroy German capital ships. And by capital ships, I mean big surface vessels like the Tirpitz, skulking, big German battleships skulking in the fjords up in Norway. And the problem is that these ships are protected by iron steel torpedo nets which hang vertically underwater. And so if you come in and drop a torpedo, it hits the anti-torpedo net rather than the ship. So the point about the bouncing bomb is that it bounces off the surface of the water and over the torpedo nets, and rather like in this picture, hits the side of the ship, sinks a little bit, then explodes, end of ship. That's the principle behind it. And initially it's the Admiralty that give him his backing. But pretty soon he suddenly realizes that actually maybe this can work on a dam. And the interesting thing is there's a whole bunch of other boffins who are developing plans of how to break the German dams. So these huge dams, the Zorpa and the Mörner, near the Ruhr, which feed water into the Ruhr. And of course you need water for the populations to drink. You also need it in industrial processes. If you can get rid of these huge, vast dams, then what a blow that would be for against Germany. That was the thinking behind it. So they were doing all these experimentations. And what they suddenly realized by accident was that proportionally a gravity dam like this is the same whatever size it is. And they discovered by accident when they were trying to destroy one of their models that not very much explosive, when exploding, detonating below the surface at a certain level and against the edge of the dam, would actually destroy it. And it was less explosive than they thought. So then they upscaled it by about 10 times to a real dam in Wales. And the results were absolutely spectacular. And they suddenly realized that they could upscale it again And the amount of ordnance, if they could just get it right, that could destroy the Möhne Dam, this vast dam feeding the Ruhr industrial heartland of Germany's war machine, could be destroyed with a bomb that could theoretically be carried by a Lancaster bomber. And suddenly there was a way to do it. At the same time, Barnes-Wallis had developed this bouncing bomb for ships, so you put the two together and suddenly you've got something that really works. So to cut a long story short, they did loads and loads of practices. They then made a prototype, which they then released from a Wellington bomber down in the south coast, off the coast of Dorset. It proved that it worked. It could bounce sort of, a mile and 3/4. And suddenly they were realizing that there was something in this, and that actually destroying the mighty Möhne Dam and the Sorpe Dam was not quite the pipe dream that it had always seemed up to that point. Harris, of course, knew nothing about these experiments. He knew nothing about what was going on. As far as he was concerned, this was a daft, batty scientist who'd come up with yet another ludicrous idea when, quite patently, the only way to bomb and destroy German military infrastructure was to send over as many bombers as possible and drop bombs over a wide area, hoping that some would hit the target. He was absolutely convinced about this. And to be perfectly honest, up until this point, he was largely right. So you can imagine on the 19th of February, when he gets a reply to his letter from Portal, Portal says, well, I have some sympathy with what you're saying, Bert. That was his nickname. But actually, I think I'm going to give this a go. I think this is worth backing. And I think this is really interesting, because Charles Portal, the higher you go up the chain of command, the fewer decisions you have to make. But those decisions that you do make are really, really difficult. And at this stage of the war, at the beginning of 1943, with Harris about to launch his all-out offensive, the decision to pour so many resources into developing this bomb in such a short period of time was a very, very brave decision. But Portal made it, and that's what made him a really, really good air chief. But the reason it had to be done in such short time was to do with water levels in these dams. Now, the optimum time to do it was it would have to be delivered by aircraft flying low level. You couldn't do it in daylight. The Augsburg raid had proved that. You have to do this in nighttime. Therefore, when you're flying that low, it's incredibly difficult to navigate. It's incredibly difficult to see. The only way you can do it is by using the light of the moon, and preferably a full moon, which again limits when you can do it. So it has to be, there's only kind of one opportunity in a month when that can be done. And realistically, by the beginning of June, the water levels are getting too low, so the bomb that Barnes-Wallis is talking about won't work. So the only time to do it, really, is one chance, one night in May 1943. But already, by the time this decision is made, we're talking about the 24th of February. And that's not giving people very long time to develop, A, a Lancaster that will carry the bomb, B, develop the bomb, because the prototype is the third largest one. The upkeep, as it's called, the bomb that's going to be dropped on the dams, is this biggest one. And that hasn't even been designed at this point, and it's not quite as simple as just making it bigger. It's a bit more complicated than that. And on top of that, to get the Lancaster that's going to have to carry this huge beast of a 4-ton bomb, which needs to rotate, incidentally, to get the best bounce off the ball. It's a bit like when you're spinning a ball in cricket. The more revolutions you put on it, the more spin you're going to get. The same principle applies when you're trying to put a bouncing bomb across water. So there's a heck of a lot to do. And on top of that, you've also got to form and create a squadron and train them specially to do this operation. And because all your bomber crews are flying at sort of 18,000 feet plus and doing the scattergun approach, this requires a whole new set of skills. Now, to do that by the middle of May, which is effectively what you're talking about, really isn't long. What you're talking about is 10 weeks. 10 weeks is no time at all, and there is absolutely no way, under any circumstances, such an operation like that would ever be done, say, today. Fortunately, this is Roy Chadwick. He was the designer of the Lancaster and the chief designer at Avro, a rival firm as well, so that potentially had all sorts of problems, but as it turned out, Chadwick and Barnes-Wallis got on incredibly well. Chadwick was a thoroughly good egg, so was Barnes-Wallis. It was fine. The whole idea that sort of rival companies might not be able to work wasn't a problem in a democracy like Britain in the middle of a war. It would have been if they were totalitarian state of divide and rule like the Nazis had. So that was a sort of feather in our bow, I suppose. And they managed to design, get on with the job of designing the specially required Lancaster. They managed to get on with the job of designing the bouncing bomb, and everything was sort of okay on that side of things, or at least it was progressing. Whether they would get it done in time was anyone's guess, but it was all looking reasonably good after the first 10 days. The second problem was forming this new squadron and who was going to lead it. Now, I mentioned that raid at the beginning of January, middle of January, that Guy Gibson was on over Berlin. This is a guy who, by that stage, was absolutely mentally and physically exhausted. He'd already done more than he should have been expected to do for someone his age and someone in the war doing the job he was doing. But the day after that raid in January, he went to see this friend he had, who was a nurse called Maggie North, who worked at a hospital nearby. And Gibson was in fact married to a wife that he was largely estranged to, and his relationship with this nurse, Maggie North, was unquestionably platonic, but it was a very intense one. And he went to see her, and she found him in the car park, sitting in his car, just chewing on the stem of his pipe, his unlit pipe. And he was just shaking. And he just turned to her and said, "Can you hold me, please?" And she said, "Well, yes, of course." And she held him until the shaking subsided. And she just said, "Was that a difficult operation last night then?" And he just nodded. In actual fact, 2 days before, he'd lost two of his best friends in an earlier raid. So by March, middle of March 1943, Gibson is finally due to be stood down from his tenureship as commander of 106 Squadron. And he's supposed to be given a bit of leave. He's going to go and see his wife. He's going to have a bit of R&R, a bit of time out, but no such luck. He gets summoned to 5 Group Headquarters, Bomber Command at Grantham, and the new air officer commanding there says, "Look, Gibson, I know you've had a long run. I know you've done more than can be expected." He's now done 75 operations, by the way. But, could you do just one more job? And Gibson thinks, "Oh my gosh, I still haven't had any leave. I'm absolutely exhausted. I'm absolutely shot to pieces." But he goes, "Well, all right." So he takes the job. Now, they have to form the squadron in a week. There's a sort of time plan, and the idea is that they're going to get only experienced crews, people who've done at least one tour of 30 operations, preferably well into their second tour. But this just isn't so easy, and a lot of although Gibson maintains in his autobiography, there we are, that all his crews were hand-picked and they were the kind of Top Gun of Bomber Command. Nothing could have been further from the truth. There were lots of people that were deeply inexperienced. One of the guys who answered the call, and he just saw a notice on the squadron notice board, 97 Squadron down the road at Woodhall Spa, was this guy on the right-hand side, a New Zealander called Les Munro. He's a great guy. He's the last pilot surviving. Another one was another crew here. This is Big Joe McCarthy, an American, also from 97 Squadron. On the left of him, the left of the picture there, is a guy called George Johnny Johnson. Johnny Johnson's the only other British surviving member of the Dams raid. And, training got underway pretty quickly. This is Les Munro and his Lancaster. And, of course, they're having to do completely different skills. This low flying is just not easy at all. They have to go from dropping a bomb at 18,000 feet plus to dropping a spinning rotational bomb on a sixpence at 60 foot off the deck. Now, the wingspan of a Lancaster is 102 foot, so that puts it into some perspective. 102 foot, and you're basically the width of one wing and the fuselage, the cockpit of the plane. That is what you've got to be. That's the height you are above the water when you've got to drop this bomb. But these guys had an absolute blast to start off with, of course. You can imagine it. They weren't on operations. They were careering around the Lincolnshire countryside at very low levels, scaring people below. Johnny Johnson told me that he was a bomb aimer, so he was at the front of a Lancaster and he could see things. And he told me that he was looking down, and they were trying to fly a little bit under 100 foot, so about 80 foot, and suddenly a Lancaster went underneath him. And he had the absolute shock of his life. And I said to him, "Well, who was it?" He said, "Well, he tried to deny it, but it was Les Munro. We knew it was Les Munro." And I asked Les Munro this. I said, "Well, was it true?" And he did confess, I have to say. Eventually, new planes turned up. These are the special adapted Lancasters. And this is how the bomb developed. Originally, Barnes-Wallis thought it was going to be a huge, great sphere, but he discovered that the casing kept breaking and the actual central cylinder, which had the explosives, kept on rolling. And this made life a lot easier because the bomb was a little bit smaller, it was easier to fix up, and that was the final one they went with. But they were still trialing it a few days before the raid actually was launched. And they were going to be divided into, there was 19 planes going to go, divided into 3 groups. 2 were going to go to, the first group was going to go to the Möhne Dam and then go on to the Eder Dam, which didn't affect the Ruhr, but was another massive one. It was the biggest dam in Germany, 202 million cubic meters of water. It's absolutely vast. And then a second group was going to go and attack the Sorpe Dam, and then a third group was going to be in reserve in case the first 2 didn't succeed. And finally, everything was as ready as it was ever going to be. Gibson had actually been advised to be grounded by the medical officer because he was suffering from piles. He was also suffering from depression. He was also suffering from mental and physical exhaustion, but he laughed off any idea of him not going on the raid. He'd also had less training than others because, of course, he was having to administer the squadron and go down and visit Barnes-Wallis and get all the plans, etc., etc. So they were slightly undercooked, to put it mildly. Now, and this is where they've got to go. They've got to go past the kind of the Ruhr, which is incredibly heavily defended. They've got to fly basically 100 foot. I cannot even begin to stress how difficult it is flying that low in a beast as big as a 30-ton Lancaster when you've also got a 4-ton bomb strapped underneath you. I mean, this requires navigation of the highest caliber. Amazingly, though, the first wave do, with the exception of 2 of them, managed to reach the Möhne Dam. And Gibson goes in first. He does a trial run, flying over, then goes in again. By the second time he goes in for the actual run, the gunners, the defences, which are on those 2 towers on the dam and on the side, are fully aware that there are Lancasters flying very low around their dam, and they start firing and coming under attack. And this is a rather good picture. This is you can see the lights here. This is the thing they have to help them aim where to drop the bomb, because altimeters don't work under 100 feet. So they've got to be exactly 60 foot when they drop this bomb. The only way to do it is when these 2 lights meet and converge in a figure of 8. Then they know they're at exactly 60 foot, so that's what happens. Gibson goes in, drops the first bomb, doesn't go off, goes round again, trying to draw the flak, and this is what's happening here. Dingy young Mickey Martin goes in second. He's the ace of low flying. He hits the dam wall. There's a huge explosion. 1,000 foot worth of water flies up into the air. But again, the dam still holds. Third one in is Hopgood. And Hopgood has the least trained crew of all, but he's an old mate of Gibson's from 106 Squadron. And he gets hit, and the pictures of the debris are pretty sobering, to be perfectly honest. There's not a single bit of it that looks like a Lancaster bomber. So most of the crew are killed, including Hopgood. Fourth one in is Dingy Young, who is the old man of the squadron at 27, and he's pretty sure he's got it right. He sees this huge fountain, and he knows it's dead center, and he's absolutely certain he's got it, and he thinks he can see the crest crumbling. David Maltby goes around. He's the fifth one. He's going in, and as he goes into his run and drops the bomb, just as he drops the bomb, suddenly the dam starts to burst, and it goes, and suddenly there's water flowing through, and they've done it. But the job's only partly done. They now have to go to the Eder Dam, which is a little way off. It's about 45 miles away. And when I flew over this, I did this I was flying at about 2,000 feet in the middle of a clear spring day. And I've got to say, it was really hard to navigate without GPS. We tried to do it just with maps and things, and just by looking at distinguishing features and so on, as they would have done. But quite a different kettle of fish now that it's night time. It's in the early hours of the 17th of May. There's little mist forming in the valleys. And to start off with, they struggle. David Shannon reaches Ada, and he thinks he's in completely the wrong bit. And it's not until Guy Gibson, who's got there as well to make sure that they're all okay, fires off a flare, that they all suddenly realise where they are. Now, this one is not defended at all, but I cannot tell you enough. This is near to impossible, because you've got this spit coming out in front of it, and you've got to get round this so that you're square on facing the dam wall when you drop it. And the problem is in a 30-ton Lancaster, to turn at 90 degrees is really hard because, of course, it wants to keep going straight. So you're battling that. And you've got this bomb that's rotating at 500 revolutions a minute, which has a huge gyro effect. So the controls are really, really sluggish. And the problem is when you're tilting, the plane tilts. When you're turning, the plane tilts, and you can't see what's below you, and you can't see what's underneath you on the other side. You've got these trees on this spit. I mean, this requires flying of just the highest caliber, and these guys are just not that well trained, and they really struggle. The first guy goes in, he can't get, he misses, it goes over the edge. David Shannon goes in, he can't do it. Yeah, you can see. Well, you can see on the top right of this picture, that's the Schloss Waldeck, and they have to come down this little valley to the left of that, and then do a 90-degree turn just over the end of the spit so that they're facing. That's the only way it's going to happen. And finally, it's Les Knight who goes in, and this is Les Knight's crew, and it's the last bomb. It's the last chance, and they managed to pull it off. And it is just one of those extraordinary feats. And when we were making a film about this, we had a crew that was in an old aircraft, twin-engine aircraft, and he was flying at 500 foot. And he was saying to do that maneuver at 500 feet is difficult, but they managed to do it. It's absolutely phenomenal. And this is the Zorpa Dam. This is a different construction, and they did manage to hit it, but they hit it twice, but didn't destroy it. And I've got to say, Barnes-Wallis wasn't expecting it. But the after effects of this of this raid were enormous, because the Myrna was a massive dam. It was one of the most famous structures in Germany, the Myrna and the Ada. I mean, it's like destroying one of the most famous edifices in India or in London or something. I mean, every German knew of these dams, so psychologically it was a massive blow. But it was also a material blow as well. And British historians in recent years have really tried to belittle this, saying it was a jolly good PR coup, and didn't they all do well? But in terms of long-term effect, it had absolutely none whatsoever, because they managed to rebuild the dams in 5 months. But I come at this from a slightly different angle, and my point is yeah, but why did they have to build it in 5 months? Because to rebuild those dams in the middle of a war, when you've just lost 250,000 men in North Africa, when you've just come out of Stalingrad, when in July 1943 you have the biggest defeat of the entire war for the Germans, which is the Battle of Kursk and the counterattack. It's the last time they ever go forward in the East. At this moment, they're diverting vast numbers of resources to rebuilding these dams. And the devastation was absolutely enormous. Every bridge destroyed, towns destroyed, factories destroyed. All this had to be rebuilt. The rebuilding process cost 756 million Reichsmarks, which is about, I can't do that in rupees, but in pounds or dollars, it's probably about $8 billion at this time of the war. I mean, this is exactly what you don't need. And you can see, whole railways had to be built, huge scaffolding. You think that's a lot of scaffolding? I mean, look at that. I mean, that's just incredible. And on top of that, they also had to build reinforced anti-aircraft defenses across the whole, over every single dam in Germany, which were vast, expensive, and a massive waste of resources, money, time, and energy at a time where Germany could least afford it. So anyone who says this was a raid that should never have been, that achieved very little, frankly, needs their head examining. Thank you.
As you've just experienced, James is a compelling storyteller. And I think what you'll find fascinating about his books is that he actually humanizes military history. He talks about ordinary soldiers, he talks about airmen, he talks about the inventors, he talks about the various strands of the decision-making process. And in this particular work, really comes down to my first question to James, is you find a remarkable degree of ingenuity. You have the ingenuity of, out of a harebrained scheme, throwing marbles in a bathtub, devise this bouncing bomb. You have an entire squadron formed of people from various parts, not only of Britain, from Australia, some Americans, a lot of Rhodesians, New Zealanders, everyone, the best and the most daring getting it. And you have the courage of the decision maker, you have the coordination among the factories. In a sense, you could say that this particular mission brought about the best in the entire war economy. To that extent, recent history has suggested that Britain's contribution to winning the war was incidental. That had it not been for Hitler's disastrous decision to declare war on the United States after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the war might have produced very, very different results in Europe. And tangentially, your book would contest that assumption.
Well, I think where the myth goes wrong is this idea that Britain is just hanging off the shirt tails of America, and as soon as America enters the war, it's going to be fine because it has this huge industrial capacity. That myth is wrong on several counts. There is absolutely no question that by the end of the war, America's armed forces are the best in the world, and the best the world has ever seen, probably. Their ability to grow, their ability to learn, particularly, is absolutely staggering. And they understand all those three different components: the tactical level, the operational level, the strategic level. They get all that, and they are absolutely superb. But what is certainly not clear is while America in 1940-41 has the potential to churn out vast numbers of tanks and aircraft and Liberty ships, there is no certainty at all that that is going to happen. And indeed, in the early years of the war, 1941, the US is completely riven by an endless stream of labor strikes, for example. And it really is down to a handful of highly entrepreneurial, highly motivated, capitalist-loving industrialists who make it happen. It is purely through pride and competition that the Liberty ship, designed by an Englishman, is then produced in 10 days by rival firms in the US. And no one ever thought that. The idea with the Liberty ship was that you would have a ship that you could mass produce to a degree that would take 120 days to manufacture. They actually make one in 5, but they are regularly churning them out in 10 to 15 days, which is incredible. Now, that is not a given at the beginning of the war, but because we look back on it retrospectively, we now think it is. But equally, it's untrue to suggest that Britain, because of America's vast growth, was therefore waning and a shadow of its former self by the end of the war, the world's largest empire in 1939, a kind of sort of a shadowy nation in sort of, terminal decline by 1945. That is simply not the case. And Britain alone, and I'm not talking about any of the dominions, Britain alone produces 102,000 aircraft by November 1944, which is 20,000 more than Germany produces in the entire war. You have to remember that on D-Day, the 6th of June, which thanks to Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, and Bloody Omaha, is perceived as predominantly an American show. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. 2/3 of the troops that were landed were British, 2/3 of the aircraft used were British, 3/4 of the landing craft were British landing craft, all 3 service chiefs were British, and indeed 972 out of 1,100 warships were British. It was predominantly a British show, and on top of that, it was British ingenuity and British designers who built and conceived and built and constructed and floated across the Channel 2 portable harbours the size of Dover each, which is just breathtaking. And I think that achievement alone is right up there with the kind of 10-day Liberty ship.
There's another perception which was certainly prevalent in Germany after 1944, which is that the Luftwaffe caused the defeat of Germany. Is it because they were technologically inadequate? Certainly your book doesn't suggest that. Or was it the sheer numbers which went against Germany?
The Luftwaffe was in a complete mess in 1939 before it even went to war. It's not perceived as such because, when we think of the beginning of the war, we think of, those pictures of tanks rolling across the Belgian border. We think of Stuka dive bombers blitzing Warsaw and all the rest of it. But in actual fact, that was predominantly spin doctoring that a lot of the Allies fell for themselves. Germany was not anything like as mechanized as it's perceived to be. And certainly of the 135 divisions that were used in the Blitzkrieg in the West, for example, only 17 were actually what we would call mechanized. The rest were on foot or using horse-drawn transport. And it is also true that the last new troop-carrying vehicle that was ordered by the Wehrmacht was a pneumatic-tired horse-drawn cart in 1941. But to go back to the Luftwaffe, dive bombing was seen as a great panacea. The idea was that if you dive bombed, you would be more accurate, and therefore you didn't need so much ordnance because you were going to destroy the job with fewer aircraft and fewer bombs. The problem is that was fine when you had complete air superiority, as they did in Poland in 1939, and as they did pretty much during the Blitzkrieg in the West. And it's also okay when your target is a fairly large factory and it's not moving anywhere. But one of the reasons why 338,000 troops were evacuated from Dunkirk, for example, is because most of them went in ships. And when you're a Stuka dive bomber, that ship doesn't look like a ship. It looks like a pencil that's moving across the sea. And it's flipping hard to hit. And they didn't hit very many, which is why so many troops got back. And suddenly, this whole strategy of dive bombing, which they'd invested so much money in, not just the Stuka dive bomber, but also the Junkers 88, which is a medium bomber, which they were trying to put dive bombing capabilities on, and also a 4-engine bomber, the Heinkel 177. They also tried to put dive bombing capabilities on that. It was a completely flawed plan. And by that time, it was too late. The priority was on other things, and they were trying to build lots of U-boats. They were trying to reinforce their armed forces on the ground, and they simply didn't have the resources, or frankly the time, to invest in a new air force and a strategic air force, which is what we were doing, i.e. an air force of large, heavy bombers that could carry up to 10 tons worth of bombs. And this was, frankly, an absolute disaster for them. So the Luftwaffe was already playing catch-up, and I don't think you can underestimate the losses it suffered during the Battle of Britain in 1940.
I'm tempted to ask many more questions, but I think some people in the audience might have. Gentlemen there.
Thanks, I'm Rajiv. James, can I take you back from the general war to the issue of bombers and bomber command? You talked about the problems of night bombing for the squadron. Taking a step back, why was it that Britain didn't go down the American route of daylight bombing with much heavier armament than the 303, say the half-inches, and going as the Americans did in massed formation with each bomber protecting its neighbors, and stuck to the night bombing, sneak in, bomb, and come back pattern?
Because they started the war when they started the strategic bombing campaign of Germany, which began on the 17th of May 1940. They started doing it in daylight, and they got absolutely massacred. I mean, Bomber Command was flying over German airfields throughout the Battle of Britain every single day, and fortunately for them at that stage, the Pas-de-Calais and Normandy were what we would now call a target-rich environment. There was a great density of airfields, and frankly, you could be as bad as you liked, but as long as you drop your bombs, the chances are you were going to hit a German airfield if you were flying over Calais. But they suffered terribly. I mean, proportionally, the losses to Bomber Command in 1940 were far greater than they were at Fighter Command. And it just evolved into night bombing, but night bombing was the way forward. And the way was led, frankly, by the Luftwaffe, who, as I'm sure you're aware, from 7th of September 1940 started a series of the night blitz of London and indeed other parts of England right through to May 1941. And they were doing night bombing, and they made a pretty good fist of destroying Coventry, for example, in November 1940. And everyone thought, well, that's the way to do it. The Americans turn up in the middle of 1942, and they go, hang on a minute, you're filling the skies at night, so we'll do the daytime stuff. and we'll give our guys 50 caliber machine guns, and we'll put body armor in, and okay, that means we won't be able to carry so much bombs because we've got, heavier machine guns and stuff. But, that's the price we're prepared to pay. And it turns out that actually that is a kind of slightly false economy, because the Americans lose every bit as many aircraft as we do flying at night. And are they more accurate? Probably not really, to be perfectly honest. But having said that, I personally think the night bombing is the way forward, because as navigational aids are improving, so it doesn't really matter whether you're in daylight or nighttime. These aids can help you to get there. And the fact is, it's not until the advent of the P-51D, which isn't until kind of, really very end of 43, very, beginning of 44, really comes to the fore in big week in, third week of February 1944, that it really sort of kicks off its importance, and they're able to escort American bombers all the way to Berlin. I mean, up until that point, which is quite late on in the war, really, a lot of bombers are doing the last bit, hardest bit, on their own. The problem with the Lancasters is, as you say, they're just horribly underarmed. And, I've been on a Lancaster, I've sat in it, and these things are, they're tin tubes. I mean, they're there for one thing and one thing only, and that's bombing. They're not for creature comforts, and they're not for protection of their aircrew. And personally, I think that is a false economy, because the idea is that if you cover lots of, smother your Lancaster with gun turrets, that causes drag, which slows them down. It means that you're losing weight to how much ordnance. Far better to keep them light, use the extra weight that they've got on bombs. But of course that's ridiculous, because you're then losing more aircraft. It's much more efficient to do more sorties, losing fewer aircraft, than the other way around. And it is frankly a disgrace. And what's really interesting is that Bomber Harris, you realise that everyone thinks now that he's the big bad guy in all this, the kind of architect of Dresden, the mass murderer who relentlessly wanted to kind of sort of turn all German cities to dust. Actual fact, he's not. He's carrying out other people's orders. He's carrying out orders of people like Portal, and you see in his papers, and the papers coming out of Bomber Command headquarters, that here is a guy who is constantly urging heavier armament of his and better gun turrets for his Lancasters, and simply not getting it. But the fact of the matter is if you're a Lancaster bomber, there's really, if you're flying at 18,000 feet, there's two ways you're going to get killed or get shot down. One of them is by flak, and the density of flak is so much that there's 15,000 heavy guns over Germany by the middle of 1944. The second way is by being a night fighter, homing in on them with their radar and using 20mm and 30mm cannon shells underneath the belly of these Lancasters, which just rips them to shreds. And the one place the Lancaster doesn't have any protection at all is underneath. It's got one on the top of the fuselage, which is frankly completely pointless, because the shells are coming from underneath, and the night fighters are coming underneath. I can't really see any circumstances in which you'd ever really use a dorsal turret. So these are problems that were being debated very heavily in the war and were never really sorted out.
I think one of the things you do, apart from putting the contribution of Britain in perspective, I think you also bring out the sheer ineptitude, in a sense, of what we thought was a ruthlessly efficient German war machine. But you've also written, I think, a foreword to the memoirs of Field Marshal Kesselring, and you've also studied the North African campaign. Purely in terms of military history, what would you say were the redeeming features of the German war machine?
Well, there's no question that on a kind of sort of man-for-man level, most soldiers were trained to a high caliber. The other thing, and this is the really key thing, is that the German troops were more motivated to fight than British ones. I mean, we're from a democracy, and if you run away, the worst that's going to happen to you is you're going to get a few months in prison and, humiliated in front of your mates. But you're certainly not going to be shot at dawn or anything like that. So keeping this conscript civilian army and air forces going and keeping them motivated is really, really difficult. And that's one of the great achievements of both the Americans and the British. I mean, the Russians and the Germans don't have this problem. You go forward, you take on the enemy, or you get shot. So most people are prepared to take, even if they're not motivated, are prepared to take a punt that it's better to have a chance of going into the firing line rather than having no chance of being executed for desertion or for cowardice. And on top of that, you do have this, the very best divisions within the German Wehrmacht do tend to be highly Nazified, highly motivated, and therefore fight better. But it's not because they've got better kit, or because they've got better generals, or they've got better lead. I mean, you know, you go to Italy and you go to the Apennines and you see these incredibly steep, jagged peaks, and you know that the US 88th Infantry Division has gone up there and lost 120% of its fighting force in 2 weeks, and they're still going up this hill. That is mind-boggling, and what I think is far more interesting is what motivated those guys to just keep going. The fact that the Allies were able to do that is, I think, really, really stupendous. I mean, the interesting thing about the Germans is that, you know, when you say Teutonic, the word that almost inevitably springs to mind that follows that word is efficiency. And yet the German war machine was about the most inefficient thing you could ever imagine. It's incredible. I mean, I really think it's incredible that they lasted as long as they did. And of course, when you go through history, most war leaders in their right mind would have surrendered, certainly in the German case, by early 1944, but very probably by the middle of 1943. But of course, the Germans weren't being led by an ordinary person. They were being led by a deranged lunatic in Adolf Hitler. And so the goalposts completely changed. I think that's one of the reasons also why they fought on for so long.
But finally, before we just wind up, being a military historian in contemporary Britain, where the mood is, sort of to say the least, fiercely anti any form of armed intervention, does that make you slightly unpopular? Are you sort of decried as a sort of remaining jingoist, a flag waver?
No, I don't think so, because I think the thing that drew me to the Second World War in the first place is the intense human drama of that conflict. I mean, there is no other conflict that Britain has ever been involved with which has affected every man, woman and child in such a way. Not even the First World War, not even the English Civil War. I mean, this conflict was so completely all-consuming for its time. And of course, in that period, you've got absolutely incredible human drama. From my point of view, you know, I look back to when I was, 2021, and I think what a feckless, callow, useless individual I was. And the idea that I might have been commanding a squadron at that age of Spitfires or something just seems absolutely incredible. So I think there is always that fascination, and I think the other thing that sustains it is that, you know, when you think about Iraq or you think about Afghanistan, you know, the moral reasons for going in, I think, are at best hazy, whereas the reasons for going to war to stop the abomination which was Nazi Germany, and particularly in light of what we'd later discovered, what it was up to in terms of the Holocaust and so on, you know, it was a just crusade. So I think it's a war that most people feel was, in a lot of wars you could argue should never have happened and were ill-conceived and ill-judged. But I think our response to it in 1940, in 1939, and indeed in 1940 was the correct one. I mean, obviously, when you start going into the areas of bombing cities and stuff, again, it gets a little bit hazy. But I think most people consider that the Second World War was a war that we had to fight.
Thank you very much, James. And I think probably the first session you've had on the Dam Busters without any repeated references to the Black Labrador.
Well, yes, I know the film coming up, and they've managed to get round this one by calling it Digger. And frankly, I don't care at all. The dog is the least important thing in the whole story, so they can call it what they like for them. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of day one at DSE Jaipur Literature Festival. Just a quick announcement. Tomorrow there's been a special session programmed into the schedule. Rajni Ubay Sekhara will be talking